Hello, listeners. Thank you for tuning in to our podcast, Disease Mechanism and Therapies. This is episode 49, titled Don't Forget the Girls. Today, we will be talking a lot about Duchenne muscular dystrophy, commonly referred to as DMD, and how it specifically affects women. But before we get into that, let's introduce everyone. My name is Roberta Banks. You can call me Bobbie, and I am a fourth-year physiological science major at UCLA.
My name is Brian, and I'm also a fourth-year physiological sciences major at UCLA.
Hi everyone, I'm Luong, and I am also a fourth-year physiological science major at UCLA.
Welcome, everyone. So I wanted to pose a question to everyone here. What do you know about the genetic causes of DMD?
Well, I do know that this disease is inherited through an X-linked recessive pattern, meaning that it will primarily affect boys. However, it is possible that girls can have it too, but it's much more rare since they would need two recessive alleles, one from each parent, meaning that both parents would have to, be able to mate and have that recessive allele to the girl. However, most of the time, the girl should have a wild type allele that should be dominant, and therefore she shouldn't have any issues expressing dystrophin.
Well, actually, Brian, don't forget the other ways that DMD can manifest in girls. There's non-random X activation of the wild-type allele, Turner syndrome in which only one X chromosome is present, and possible translocations between the dystrophin locus and another autosome.
That is true. Plus, having one dominant wild type allele doesn't always lead to a perfectly healthy life.
Oh, really? That sounds really interesting. Do we have an example of that?
Yeah, according to an article from MCBI, there was this one case where a 20-year-old woman had a phenotype very similar to boys in severity. She had difficulties walking since she was 5. She has experienced a fast clinical course of progressive weakness in her lower limbs, and she was bound to a wheelchair when she was 9 years old. As you can imagine, this led to other issues such as obesity, sleep apnea, and reduced vital capacity in her lungs. Therefore, her dominant allele didn't necessarily mean that she'd have a wild type outcome.
So it looks like there's a bit of a misconception there regarding that dominant allele. I suppose there's a lot more to women with Duchenne than meets the eye, or rather the basic stuff that we learned in, previous biology classes. So it looks like we might have to do some research on this.
And with that being said, let us introduce you to the purpose of this podcast, which is to discuss issues that cannot necessarily be solved through therapies and drugs, and issues that arise specifically when we investigate DMD in women.
So one of the things that we discussed so far in our studies were the symptoms that boys with Duchenne suffered with, including difficulty walking, weakness in skeletal muscle, and eventually difficulties breathing. Typically, these symptoms are much more consistent in the phenotypes of boys, considering that we only have one X chromosome that needs to be mutated. What we learned about these symptoms is very consistent with an article I actually read about from authors EPMU and Andrew Kornberg that explain how boys with Duchenne are affected by, quote, gross motor delay, gait abnormalities, as well as complications such as cardiomyopathy and scoliosis. On the other hand, the genotype of women with Duchenne is not as predictive of their phenotype, and this is something that must be considered when we're talking about multidisciplinary care for women with Duchenne.
Wait, that is so interesting, Brian. What do you mean by that exactly?
Well, I know that one of the ways that Duchenne is diagnosed is through genetic testing, specifically by whole exome sequencing. However, the genotype of these exomes may not be the best indicator of the potential symptoms that they could have in the near future.
Yeah, earlier I talked about a case of a 20-year-old woman with Duchenne. Do you think that's something about a woman's genotype as opposed to a man's genotype that makes it so that women tend to present with such a fast course of disease progression?
Well, that's the thing. Even if we did know the exact genotype of the woman, we may not be unsure of whether or not they'll be present with symptoms of Duchenne. For those with one affected allele, it's understandable that they'd have symptoms if somehow the other X chromosome isn't functioning as usual. But even in the case of having a heterozygous genotype in which one allele is wild type, women have been shown to actually have differences in how their phenotypes turn out.
Right. You were mentioning how you were about to do some research on that, right? What were you able to find?
Well, I found a couple of case studies actually. One woman was 62 years old and she was a carrier who presented with frequent falling, widespread chronic pain, and progressive weakness in her lower limbs. And another woman was 34 years old. She was also a carrier and she also had weakness in her lower limbs as well.
Really? 34 and 62 years old.
Yeah, even though both of them were carriers and both presented signs of Duchenne muscular dystrophy, it appears that their courses of disease progression were entirely different.
Wow, it's really striking how unpredictable these outcomes can be for women. And it just goes to show how much is unknown about the complete pathology of Duchenne in women. That's actually another point I wanted to bring up. So one of the issues I saw while digging around was that a lot of clinical research on DMD specifically focuses on boys with Duchenne, and not a lot of work was done on girls. In fact, I came across this one case study of a mother who attended this huge conference all about muscular dystrophies and the current research addressing them. It's called Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy.
The Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy. I wasn't even aware that event even existed.
Yeah, let me show it up on my screen right now. And she was actually a mother of three girls, two of which had symptoms consistent with Duchenne, and one of which was much more severe than the other.
Really? Oh, I'm so sorry for them. I can't even imagine how difficult it must be to experience that as a parent, especially because DMD in girls is frankly just really rare.
Well, that's not even the end of it. According to a video that I found of her attending the conference, she was talking about how all the seminars were primarily geared towards treating boys. It wasn't until an attendee actually brought up the topic of enrolling girls into clinical trials for treatments.
Wait, really? Considering the research that has been done on DMD all these years, I'm surprised that girls weren't really represented well enough in those studies.
Yeah, even the CEO of Sarepta Therapeutics was there, and he admitted to the audience that their company hadn't even considered it.
Yeah, it's no wonder that it was quite a challenge for me to search for different articles on Duchenne in women and girls. And it really goes to show how valuable these different case studies are to provide us different insights on this road less traveled. But I'll open up this question to the both of you. So based on what we're talking about right now, what do you think are some ways to increase representation of women in Duchenne research?
Well, one easy answer that is thrown around a lot is to, of course, increase awareness of not only Duchenne, but also the fact that women experience it differently than men. I actually found out about this really cool blog by someone named Ferial who has Duchenne. She actually runs a blog on Facebook all about her travels, and it's called Travel in Wheelchair. One of the main messages that she tries to promote is to always have a positive attitude and to live life as it is in the moment.
Oh, I really like that. What does your blog look like?
Well, I'm glad you asked. Let me pull it up right now. Well, I actually couldn't find that exact blog, but I did find a support group on Facebook for girls with DMT and their families, and Ferial is greatly involved in this group as well.
Oh, wow, that's really nice.
Yeah. Well, I suppose that a reasonable approach to increasing representation of women in Duchenne research is to simply find ways to recruit more of them into studies. But as we all know, that's easier said than done. So, how do you think we can, go about that long? And just to address all the logistics of it, how can we go about funding it?
It's definitely a massive challenge trying to recruit as many female subjects as possible for similar research, all thanks to the absolute rareness of DMD in women. I mean, just look at the ratio of boys to girls who have DMD. However, one idea that I had was to simply bring awareness to the potential of being a carrier. In a lot of women with DMD, the health complications can come at any age. A woman could be a carrier and not even know it for most of her life.
Well, Long, you're right. That ratio is no joke.
Like Brian said before, pathology can be very unpredictable. In order to address this, I think genetic testing is a really good idea and is a healthy practice in general. An early diagnosis will be crucial for treatment and support. Even if you never develop symptoms, I'd say preparation is always better should any complications arise. And since this is a genetic disorder, family planning will be something to consider too, which we'll go into later. Apart from medical care, you'll also be encouraged to participate in research which contributes to representation. Maximizing representation and recruitment into research will be the best way to learn more about and how to combat DMD in women. As for funding, that's a difficult question. I mean, just look how much it costs pharmaceutical companies to do their jobs. And that's not considering all the costs of transportation and ensuring that each participant is in good hands, is treated ethically, and is always aware of every step of the process. One suggestion I have is, well, what we're doing here today. I think talking about DMD and especially DMD in women goes a long way about raising awareness for the condition. We've seen that the most well known diseases get the most money because people know more about it. However, since DMD is such a rare disease and it's even more rare in women, the disease just doesn't get the exposure to attract funding. And of course, this can be met with publicizing the disease and advertising donation or DMD donation centers in commercials. Once people and investors are more informed of the severity of DMD and its outcomes, they'd be more inclined to support it. Hopefully, by having this sort of research dedicated to women, it would eventually lead to therapies and an overall more optimized approach to helping these women.
That reminds me of another pattern I noticed during my investigation. Something that I noticed that really affected women with DMD was how much access they had to healthcare.
Ooh, you bring up a really good point, Bobbie. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, of course. So, as you probably know, access to quality healthcare and treatment options for low to mid income individuals is quite difficult to obtain. Qualifying for benefits or even being able to afford sustainable insurance is hard for a lot of people. Take, for instance, diabetes, which is a relatively common disease in America. It has medication that ranges from $200 to $500 a month for individuals that are not insured. Can you imagine how expensive medication would be for a relatively rare disease such as DMD?
Wait, you would think for something so common like diabetes, there would be more of an incentive to make it affordable.
Yeah, you took the words right out of my mouth. So Bobbie, are you saying that DMD treatments are even more expensive than that?
Brian, they are 50 times more expensive than that. I mean, I did some research and came across a man named Chris Pilas, I believe. Apologies for butchering your last name, Chris. But he is an immunology analyst at Global Data, and he states that current exon skipping products cost around $1 million per patient annually. And that's not even the worst part, right? So, according to the pharma letter, upcoming gene therapies for DMD will cost $2 million per patient per year. So, this is more than double of the cost of what current DMD medical treatment, is.
I mean, that just blows my mind having it that expensive. I mean, they must have other options that are less, pricely, you know?
I mean, they do. Like, there's a second generation steroid agent for DMD called Emflaza. It costs approximately $175,000, can range all the way up to $275,000 per year, which is significantly less expensive than the option we just talked about. However, the effectiveness of this treatment option isn't as high, and overall, not many people can afford a treatment option that is within the six-figure range. So imagine if you are uninsured, how would you get these costs covered?
That is a very fair point. It's so unfortunate that our current medical system makes it really hard for people who have rare diseases to afford their treatment and medications.
Yeah, and unfortunately, access to proper healthcare goes far beyond finances. As a female with DMD, your access to resources within your residential state or even healthcare professionals that know how to effectively help you manage your disease is very low. Actually, Long, can you put that first slide back up on the screen? I
Yeah.
want to introduce you to the case study of Elizabeth Heller. Elizabeth, who is now 35 years old, is a manifesting carrier of DMD. She's pictured on the top left-hand corner at an event for the Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy. Now, what makes Elizabeth so unique is that she is one in a very small handful of women who have and manifest symptoms of DMD. She didn't receive her diagnosis until she reached 11 years old. Prior to her diagnosis, she was very active. She used to play sports, and her parents had noticed that she started falling a lot and was having trouble running. And it wasn't until she saw her pediatrician who noticed that some of her symptoms were very common with those that we see with DMD.
Wow, really? So she probably would have gone a lot longer without getting checked out by a health professional unless her parents brought her in to be seen.
Exactly. And Elizabeth cites her parents for being a major support system throughout her journey with DMD. However, throughout her journey with DMD, she notably mentions how access to proper treatment and healthcare was hard for her to find. Elizabeth is from Arizona, and in Arizona, Elizabeth says that there are not a lot of resources there for her to utilize. She doesn't have a lot of social support from the state, and there is no Medicaid waiver there. She is married and has income coming in, so she does not qualify for benefits. Luckily, she can rely on the support of groups such as the Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy for social support.
So what you're saying is she doesn't qualify for benefits and doesn't have a lot of access to proper healthcare in Arizona. Because of all of this, have her symptoms worsened over time?
Um, Luckily, no. In terms of her symptoms, she states that she has about half normal lung function, which she says is enough. She doesn't need a ventilator for breathing assistance, but she has to be very careful with what she eats. She has to hire people for her or to help her get out of bed and to help her get to work, and she cannot use the bathroom independently. For treatment, she uses the Flazacort, which is a way or a treatment to help her maintain her muscle strength.
So, how does her symptoms affect her daily life? Is she still able to work?
Yeah, so she is successfully able to work. She's a spatial analysis and mapping. She does spatial analysis and mapping for the Arizona Department of Water Resources. However, her symptoms have made daily living very difficult. She's been disabled her whole life, and although she wants kids, she and her husband did not plan on having any children because she is reluctant to risk passing the disease on for future generations.
So, not only is daily living for her difficult, this impacted her family planning decisions too?
Yeah, exactly.
Wow, that is really difficult to hear, especially because family planning is such a huge obstacle for many individuals with DMD.
Actually, Long, that reminds me, one of the articles I was reading about was all about the different experiences that girls had during their treatments for Duchenne. And one of the topics that came up very frequently was indeed family planning. And one of the concerns that they had was the potential of passing on these alleles to their own offspring and fearing that they would be affected by this disease as well. For example, one of them said that they would choose to have an abortion if they knew that they were a carrier of the DMD allele because she had family members in the past that had Duchenne and suffered through it. And this is something that she wouldn't wish on her own son. So if possible, she would choose that abortion.
I've never thought of abortion as a possible form of healthcare to prevent issues associated with Duchenne.
Well, I don't blame you. It's not super easy to see that immediate connection between, muscular dystrophies and, family planning. But that does bring up another issue in regards to access to healthcare. With the recent overturn of Roe v. Wade, and now that access to abortion is ultimately up to the states to make the decision, certain carriers may not have that option to have an abortion, if they choose to not to if they choose not to potentially pass on their allele to their children. And even though they may be a very small minority of women in those particular states, the hard fact is that they don't have that aspect of healthcare anymore.
With all that's been said, I wanted us to shift gears and really discuss ways that we think we can address some of these issues. So does anyone want to start us off?
Yeah, I'll go. So one of the issues that we talked about was the issue of increasing funding for research to be done on women with Duchenne. And I loved your idea, Long, being able to bring more awareness to Duchenne so that we could encourage more people to care about it as if it's a commonplace disease. Another idea that I had was to put forth these issues out there to as many groups as possible who have that power and that money to have lobbyists who can voice our concerns about Duchenne.
Yeah, and hopefully those lobbyists can also root for policies that ease up access for finding treatments for people like Elizabeth.
But isn't the money required for such research extremely expensive, like upwards to hundreds of millions? Do you think simply voicing out on these matters will produce that much money?
Well, that's a great question. Well, I do know that lobbying is a great way to influence legislation, policies, and a whole lot of other government decisions. And in fact, a lot of biomedical research is indeed funded by the federal government. For example, the National Institutes of Health. Plus, a lot of these groups can include patient advocacy organizations. And I definitely know that these people are definitely passionate about finding solutions for women with Duchenne through research.
You also brought up the topic of access to abortions as a form of healthcare for women choosing not to have children, as to not risk them, suffer with DMD. What do you think is a good approach to that, given today's current circumstances?
Yeah, with all that going on, I can't think of a better time to focus on the options to healthcare that women have. Some of the issues that affect women right now and affect them disproportionately, in fact, is being able to find affordable treatments as well as accessible clinics. So one of my ideas for that kind of relates back to when I talked about reaching out to different groups and organizations. And I do know that if they are capable of having lobbyists that can voice their concerns to the government, I'm sure that they are well prepared to help provide financial support to those who need it.
And it's not just abortion that I think should be available for those that choose it, but I think counseling is important too. A lot of these testimonies that I read were very saddened by the fact that having children could risk them having Duchenne, and that could be a very difficult truth to adjust to. One of the topics that we talked about in class was that psychosocial support was one part of multidisciplinary care for DMD. And with so many women who wanted to start families, it makes sense to have specialized counseling just for them.
I agree. With such a difficult disease to navigate, they deserve all the support that they have available to them.
It looks like there's a lot of work to be done in order to really optimize the way that we approach DMD for women so that they can receive the same multidisciplinary care as men do. Although our podcast isn't going to provide immediate solutions to these obstacles, we hope by listening in, you were able to gain some insight on issues that aren't very apparent, but issues that have been shown to affect so many women with DMD. Thanks so much for listening, and we hope that you are inspired to help work towards a better future for all women with Duchenne muscular dystrophy.